and welcome to the 8th episode of Recluse Horror. This is a daily horror movie review podcast. I apologize if the sound sounds a little bit different. The sound is going to be a little funny today in general. I am recording outside of my normal recording area, and I also have... So Sam wasn't able to watch the movie with me today, Sam being my almost permanent co-host. He wasn't able to watch the movie with me today. However, he was able to record with me the secondary review that I'm going to be doing today, as I know that he really liked this one, so we recorded that separately. So the two sounds the rooms are probably going to sound different. I apologize for that if it bugs you. I have gotten, I hope, better at sort of mixing the sound in general. I have been, sort of trying to work on that. I understand, like, the fuzziness sometimes of the audio can be a little bit off-putting to some people, so I'm working on it. I'm not a sound engineer, so... Just a little background on this project in general. So in April of last year, on my birthday, I decided I wanted to watch and review a horror movie every single day. I have done so. Today will be my 275th day in a row of doing this. However, it's only the 8th episode of the podcast. I decided to switch formats after a while. The other ones were text reviews. So the movie that I watched today is Nightmare from 1964. Now this is a Hammer film. For those of you not familiar with it, if you're a horror fan, please become familiar with it as soon as you possibly can. Hammer is sort of... They were around from the 30s until, well, I think they might still be around. I'm not positive on that one. I haven't seen anything from them in a while. It's a British film production company. They are almost single-handedly credited with bringing back Gothic horror. After the World War II, there was a lot of focus on, and during, actually, there was a lot of focus on sort of atomic age monster movies, rather than standard Gothic horror, vampire, that sort of thing. And Hammer, again, is credited sort of with bringing that back. They're a really great company. They made, I think, around 50 films that can be considered horror movies, in the loose definition of horror movies. They have films, most of their films are a part of series. They're very well known for their Dracula films, as well as their Frankenstein films. They're also well known for being, if you've seen a movie with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, it probably was a Hammer film. They also used Ingrid Pitt, who is well known for her vampire movies. They're, not necessarily part of the Dracula, canon, but they are vampire films, and they're very well regarded, and sort of avant-garde for the time, actually. Yeah, it's a really great production company, but I've only reviewed one thing that was sort of a Hammer horror movie. It's actually a part of a TV show thing that they had, a series of almost movies, sort of made for TV movies, that really is sort of considered more of a television show, but it, they have hour-and-a-half long episodes, or however long the story takes. So basically a movie. The reason why I have sort of avoided Hammer thus far, I really have been wanting to watch the Hammer films, but unfortunately most of them belong to these long series, and I am anal retentive about watching things in the intended order. So if I don't have every copy of something, every entry in a series, for the most part, I won't do it, especially if I don't have the early ones. So Hammer Films, fantastic company. Nightmare from 1964 is about a young woman. She's 17, who is away at boarding school, and she's been plagued with these nightmares for a long time. She has these nightmares due to a sort of phobia of mental illness, which is sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy if you think about it. If you're worried about being mentally ill, you're causing yourself stress and anxiety, and sort of making it true. But anyway, she has these nightmares, and eventually gets removed from the boarding school and has to go home, where the nightmares sort of continue on from that point. This is a psychological horror movie, if you hadn't guessed from the subject matter. So if you do have problems with watching material involving mental illness and the things that, can sort of happen in situations when people have severe mental illness, then this is probably not like the best option for you. Mind you, it doesn't come off feeling realistic in the sense of the portrayal necessarily in some respects, simply because there's a certain particular type of style associated with the 60s as far as acting is concerned, and a lot of the ways people react are not necessarily true to life. So honestly, I would say err on the side of caution, of course. Take your mental health seriously. So it was a very good film. I did really appreciate it. There was a mostly female cast, which was sort of neat. I liked that. It's not the only time Hammer has done a primarily female cast, but I'll talk about that if I ever get into those movies. Another thing to probably take note of, if you have a headache or something, I had just a slight developing headache when I started to watch this. There's a lot of very high-pitched screaming in this movie. So if that's something that's going to exacerbate, a headache or something like that, maybe watch it another time. Now, the cinematography and lighting in this movie is really incredible. There are some really neat shots involved in it, in the movie, including there's a specific shot when they're transitioning from someone talking about something that happened in the past to them actually showing it, that is done just extraordinarily well. Basically, the camera sort of, and I usually don't get into specifics of shots, but this one really impressed me for the time. They're talking about it, and they pan away from the characters towards the open door, and then as they go through the door, they go into the area where the memory took place, which I thought was a really interesting thing. It's not quite something I had seen from that era, the mid 60s, not the 40s. So I thought that was really neat. And there are a number of other shots that are very good as well. Of course, I won't ruin them. I'll let you view them. But that was one specifically that I really, really wanted to talk about. It's just it's a sort of ahead of its time shot, I thought. So the plot is very dramatic, as you might guess. It's a pretty large cast, at least for something where you get to know the characters as well as you do in this. There are a couple of, definitely lower supporting actors, as well, as the main cast. And the main cast is pretty large. There's the number of people who are in, five or more scenes is pretty high. And all of them are pretty well fleshed out. I mean, you don't necessarily get specific background on everybody, but you do get a very good sense of all of their personalities. Even some of the minor characters, actually, you get a very good sense of their personalities, which is something I really appreciate, especially in a psychological horror movie. You really want to get to know the characters in something like that, in my personal opinion. It was, I thought the pacing was very good. It's definitely on the slower side if you're not used to 60s horror. That's something that you will need to sort of get used to if you're planning on watching a lot of 60s horror. As I've said before on the podcast, the 60s is probably my favorite era of horror movies. Part of that is probably because my favorite movie, certainly my favorite horror movie, is Rosemary's Baby, which is, a 60s horror movie. But there are a number that are just really phenomenal out of that era. They were just sort of starting to transition into doing, the sort of, what's the word for it? The sort of cinematography where you're not getting a camera in a fixed position or something, mimicking a pretty natural feel. They were starting to sort of spread their wings a little bit in terms of cinematography. In my personal opinion, I am not a film historian, But yeah, there's some really interesting stuff, and there is a lot of really good psychological horror. I have a specific, sort of love of psychological horror when it's done well, and I think this was done very well. Again, the pacing might turn some audiences off. It is black and white. I've heard from a number of people in my many, many years of talking about movies, that some people just don't enjoy black and white films, and I will never for the life of me understand that. But if for some reason you're turned off by black and white films, I guess don't watch this one. So the plot really keeps you guessing. That was one of the things that, my brain was going a mile a minute for almost the entire time I was watching this movie. It was really something. I kept making these leaps, and, sometimes I would be right, and oftentimes I wouldn't. I thought the unpredictability was a really good facet of a psychological horror movie. If you have a psychological horror movie and you see where everything's going, you either have to build a very strong sense of dread of knowing, oh my gosh, this poor person, or, oh my gosh, these people don't know what they have in store for them. This one definitely took the tack of just trying to be unpredictable in the sense of, the story as a whole is just a very strong narrative and a very, I thought it was pretty inventive. I've definitely seen a few things that were like this. There's a specific novel that this sort of reminds me of, which I won't tell you in case you've read it because it's definitely a spoiler. But I believe that was written after this movie. But yeah, the unpredictability, especially in films about mental illness, I think that makes sense as, with severe mental illness, those people can sort of be pretty unpredictable themselves. Of course, it depends quite a bit on the specific person and the specific illness. But in my particular experience with family members with mental illness, there's definitely a level of unpredictability there that I think using that, whether it's intentional or not, using that as a way to sort of characterize mental illness in general is pretty interesting. Talking about the specific sort of series of events that happens in this movie is definitely a disservice to anybody who wants to watch it. So there's really not a whole ton else that I can say about the movie other than, that I did enjoy it, and I think that anybody who's interested in psychological horror will find something to like about it. It's certainly not the best psychological horror that I have seen. There are a number of movies a little bit later in the 60s that go a little bit deeper into the idea of sort of, they go a bit darker than this movie ever really gets. I think that's another facet of some 60s movies, is that they don't go too far sort of into the rabbit hole, depending on who the director is and exactly what point in the 60s that you're talking about. I did think that the interpretation that the movie had of the specific mental illnesses that they're sort of emulating with this movie were pretty realistic. I think by this point, they weren't just thinking about everybody as being, anyone with mental illness as being completely nuts and crazy and somebody who should be locked up in an insane asylum and constantly cackling and so forth. Just the very basic idea of a madman, I think, had sort of gone by the wayside, which for me personally, as somebody who does suffer from certain forms of mental illness, thankfully I'm in a functional level with it. But many people that I have met and many people that I am close with are not really in that group, unfortunately. So having a realistic or even mildly realistic interpretation of mental illnesses in a movie that's this early, I really appreciated that. There are definitely a couple of things that could have been explained a bit better, specifically in the ending of the movie, and some things that just kind of weren't explained. You can sort of guess, but it's not totally necessary to the film, but I did feel like there was a little bit of a question mark at certain parts of the end, at how they arrived where they were with the ending there. It wasn't a totally severe negative, and I did really like the ending where they went with it. I just thought they could have added in just a touch more to sort of fill in those gaps. I think with everything else, they did a very good job of explaining how certain things happened or why certain things happened. And in the particular case of the end, they kind of went with the don't worry about it method, which I would have preferred a legitimate explanation or something like this. There is an element of mystery to this movie. They do a very good job of keeping you on your toes as far as trying to figure out what you're seeing is real and what you're seeing is not, and what the character is seeing is real and what the character is seeing is not. And it's pretty interesting. In a certain way, parts of the film sort of feel like almost two films. I think this might be a case for 4-act cinema. There is a 4-act structure, and I'm not totally familiar with how that works. I think this might be a version of this. I would have to look into it to be sure, and I could be totally wrong. But there are certain ways where it feels sort of like there's an extra act in there, which being that most modern cinema at least does follow or can be fit into a 3-act structure. I did sort of find that a little it just felt a little different. Not that there's any particular problem with that, but some people might feel like that makes the pacing feel a little funny. I didn't really have any problem with the pacing, or the idea that it might be a 4-act structure. But some people might be put off by it just because, the whole idea of a beginning, middle, and end is a little bit shifted in this movie. If you are interested in psychological horror, the 60s is a good era for you. Both in American films, there's a couple of French films. There's a really large number of psychological horror movies that come out of the 60s. I think the ones that I like tend to be more towards the later part of the 60s, but that's not 100% true. There are some really great ones, if you are not opposed to Roman Polanski, due to his, sort of personal life. There is a series, of loosely related movies, called the Apartment Trilogy. It involves Rosemary's Baby, a movie called The Tenant, and another called Repulsion. Basically, the only thing that really unites them, other than being psychological horror movies, is that they happen to take place in apartments. But it is a very good set of movies. Some of the entries would appeal to certain audiences, and while others would appeal to other audiences. I think for every person you ask, they'll rank those films differently. I of course like Rosemary's Baby the best, but Repulsion and The Tenant are both very good as well. But there's a lot of other psychological horror as well. Those are just the ones that come immediately to mind. For me personally, yeah, if you're looking for a good psychological horror movie, check out the 60s in general. For that, I feel like especially the sort of later part in 65, 66 and beyond, I would say. And you're more than welcome to check out this movie as well. I think this is a pretty good entry. It's not totally characteristic of the sort of pantheon of Hammer horror movies, but it is a very good entry in it, even if it feels a lot different from some of them. Certainly while the sets are very pretty and they're definitely sort of older, they're not exactly gothic. It is set in what would have been modern times at that point, so it's not and in a sort of populated area. It's not set in like Romania in some tiny town somebody got lost in or something like that. So it does feel 60s modern, but it's very beautiful. Like I said, the lighting is incredible for this movie. There's obviously a very strong hand at the helm here for this movie. I didn't happen to look up the director for this one because it's already very, very late. I've had a very long day already. But it was also an emotionally exhausting day, and I find that sometimes watching psychological horror movies when you've had an emotionally stressful day can be bad. But in this particular case, I think it was good. There's a lot of intrigue. There's a lot of the film keeps you guessing quite a bit in this movie, and I think that really helped to take my mind off of the problems that arose today, and the good things. Actually, there were emotional highs and lows today, and I think this really sort of grounded me a little bit, because I was just constantly trying to figure out what was going on, and making wild guesses as to where the movie was going. Sometimes I was right, and sometimes I was wrong, and I think that's the mark of a good movie. It doesn't feel like it's trying to do things specifically to throw you off the track necessarily. That can sometimes feel a little disingenuous, or like the filmmakers are lying to you in a sense. I feel like pretty much everything was done in such a way that while it was intriguing, it wasn't straight up lying to you. I have a pet peeve about filmmakers specifically feeling like they're doing things that are intentionally deceptive, or only doing it for the sake of throwing off the audience, unless they're very, very minor things. And this certainly doesn't do that. I think that's pretty much all I have to say about the movie. If you like psychological horror, if you like 60s movies, if you like Hammer films, this is a pretty interesting entry, even if it doesn't feel exactly like the Hammer movies that you're probably used to. So go ahead and check it out. Once again, this next segment was recorded in a different area, so I apologize if the sound quality and all of that is slightly different, if the room tone is a little bit different. I have been trying to mix out room tone, but of course you can only do so much when you're recording in different areas. So, I hope you enjoy our discussion of the Braniac. Okay, so for every review that I do, every episode of this podcast that I do, I record one review about a movie that I watched that day, and then I go over another movie that I reviewed in text and just give any impressions and memories that I have from watching that. This was the one that lines up with today, is the Braniac from 1962. It's a foreign pick. It's another Foreign Friday pick that I made from Mexico. It's called El Barón del Terror, El Barón del Terror, which is the Baron of Terror. In English, it's called the Braniac, and I'll be referring to it by that name. That's the one I happen to know. And with me is Sam for this review.
Hey.
And Sam, you watched this with me. How did you enjoy this one?
Probably more than I should have.
I think that's fair. I
probably enjoyed it way more than I should have.
I think that's totally fair. So I felt like the movie is so close to being great, although it's a totally schlocky sci-fi horror film. But it's almost mesmerizing. There's so many problems with this movie, and it's so confusingly compelling. I felt like it almost feels like two movies. Do you remember that?
Oh yeah, it's weird for sure. 'Cause things just happen in it.
The Braniac. The Braniac is about a man that's burned at the stake for witchcraft and other crimes by the Inquisition in 1661. I wrote down the date. As the pyre is lit, A comet is passing overhead, and the man vows to return from death when the comet passes the Earth again in 300 years, and kill off all of the Inquisitor's descendants that condemned him to death. At least that's what half the movie is about. It mostly takes place in present-day Mexico in 1960.
Yeah, but that's probably 15 minutes of the movie.
Yeah,
the movie is barely an hour.
Yeah, it is. It's a very short film, as I recall. I mean, a feature length, but barely on that line. Most people consider a feature length about 90 minutes, and this is well under that, I think. So, what did you think about the effects in the movie? Do you have any memory of the effects?
They're bad. They're bad effects.
But they're charmingly bad, I thought.
Specifically in the beginning, the first part, the atmosphere is really good.
It is,
and there's some effects
creepy.
that they use to do that. Mm-hmm. And those are implemented really good.
Yeah. But that's why it feels like a different...
Yeah, it feels very different because of this change of setting. Mm-hmm. But after that, I couldn't think of any effects that weren't incredibly cheesy or dated or both. Yeah.
So the comet in question is a static image that looks it looks more like a lens scratch on the telescope than like an actual celestial body of any kind. It's really funny. I think they tried to show it with a sparkler another time, which was hilarious and just terribly classic for that time. Well, I mean, it's a little late for that, but I guess filmmaking in Mexico at the time, maybe more in line with the 50s than the 60s, probably. It wasn't a huge industry in Mexico. The images of the stars around the comet are blurry, and they definitely don't look like what you would see looking through a telescope. At least I don't assume that they would be, even in the 60s. I don't think a telescope image would look like that. There are a lot of scenes with backdrops that are so obvious that your eye is drawn to them and make you have to rewind to catch the dialogue again. Do you remember doing that at all? Do you remember me doing that? Kept going back and being like, I was just so focused on the backdrop or the matte painting.
Yeah.
That I missed the whole actual plot that was unfolding. This one was also in black and white. But the movie that I just watched was from 1964, and that was in black and white. So it's not terribly, surprising to see that. So what about the monster? Do you want to talk about the monster?
I don't remember it super great. So you go ahead and maybe it'll.
Well,
remind me.
It looks terrible for the exact same reasons that it looks awesome. That's what I felt like. I won't ruin what it looks like by trying to describe it, but there are several points in the movie that you can see the poor actor in the mask panting so hard. Do you remember that?
No, I don't.
Yeah, he's wearing a rubberized mask, and he's just panting hard enough and fast enough that I kind of felt like he might be hyperventilating. Mm-hmm. I'm guessing 60s Mexico did not have a whole lot in terms of central air. So I'm sure he was just dying inside of that thing.
I just looked it up to refresh myself.
Yeah.
And I forgot he's hilarious.
Yeah, it's incredible.
He's hilarious. He's good.
Now, maddeningly, I was never really certain if this was an intentional thing to make the mask, look menacing, or if the actor was just about to pass out. But it only happens about half the time that the monster's on screen, so I'm sort of guessing it depended on whether they were doing night scenes or day scenes or something like that. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of. Unless, or maybe the beginning of the day, the end of the day. It definitely wasn't consistent, so it seems like it probably wasn't intentional. So what did you think about the manner in which he attacks the Inquisition people's relatives?
Different ways, right?
Yeah, well, sort of.
Are we talking about it?
No, we're not. I'm just asking your opinion on it.
The whole thing's amazing.
Uh-huh.
The movie's incredibly great and bad.
Yeah.
Specifically how it's hard to say for me to say without
spoilers.
Yeah, spoiling.
Okay.
What happens.
Well, one thing that I thought was really funny is that when there is an attack in the movie, it would probably be sort of hard to realize for a second that that's what was happening, except for that there's always those really strong dramatic musical stings that accompany all of the actions in the whenever anything happens, basically, whenever there's an attack happening. It's really something. Watching those attacks is something. It's totally classic cheesy. Again, it's probably more in line with something that you would see in the 50s and the 60s, at least out of American cinema. But it's really interesting. So, do you want to talk about the plot without getting into
spoilers?
Yeah, spoiler territories or anything.
There's not much more to the plot than we've already said. Like I said, it's one of the things I enjoyed about it is it's not too. Mm-hmm. It's not very long. It's not very complex.
No.
So if you just want to see kind of a cool, kind of stupid, like 60s horror movie,
mm-hmm.
It's really accessible and
yeah. So there were just a ton of unresolved plot threads. Do you remember that?
Yeah,
at all?
I totally remember that.
Okay. Well, there were so many of them that I have to assume that either the budget ran out before they could finish filming everything, or the producers just completely cut the movie to shreds. Or maybe some of the footage was lost. When I did the review for this, I did try to look that up. And I really couldn't find any information about it, which was totally maddening. This movie is just such a conundrum to me. And I really wanted to figure out, it made me sort of obsessed with it. And I know even after I finished doing the review and posted it, I went back and still tried to find the answers because I was that into it. Even though, I know I'm doing this every day and I'm spending, 4 or 5 hours or something, on doing this stuff. It's still, I was just entirely enamored with this movie on a certain level. Parts of the movie were pretty clever, while others are totally laughable. There's definitely scenes missing. Do you remember feeling specifically that there were?
Yeah, there's things that happen that you're just like, wow, where did that come from? Where did they get this thing from?
Yeah, and they're not insignificant scenes.
No,
either.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I won't get too much into the specifics about anything, but like I said, I looked on the internet to try to find anything about missing footage or anything like that. Like I said, it started to feel like there were two movies at a certain point, that they sort of
mashed two movies together.
Yeah, but there's definitely threads between them that make it really hard to believe that that's true. Maybe I hadn't really ever specifically had this thought, but maybe they tried to film like a full sci-fi film and they realized like either they lost footage or whatever, and they realized they didn't have enough, so they went back and added in the scenes about the Inquisition stuff later.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's any number of explanations for this, and
they
just don't know what
they could have been making multiple movies with some of the same people.
Yeah,
and then realize that they don't have enough stuff. They used to do a lot of that back in that time.
Yeah.
Just be filming things.
Yeah.
And maybe those were just two things they were filming with similar people. And
right.
And like that whole beginning scene could have been a whole nother movie they made.
Yeah, absolutely.
With complete different actors.
Right.
And just use the set for the day or whatever.
Right. I know that nobody is listening to this, but if anybody were to ever listen to this or stumble upon it somehow and listen to this episode, please, if you have any knowledge of what happened with this movie, please send me an email. My email for the show is reclusehorror@gmail.com, and I am dying to know what happened with this movie. It is the biggest cinema mystery that I've come across in this entire project, and I just can't. It's baffling. Now, if you're interested in filmmaking, or if you're, interested in 60s movies, early foreign movies, or early Mexican cinema, there's any number of people that I think would be interested in this. Or if you just like, cheesy sci-fi action monster movie sort of horror something movies, I think this is a really good entry. Now, you do have to sort of take it in the same way that you would watch a horror comedy, because if you try to take this movie seriously, again, you're gonna have just like the worst time, I think, watching this movie. There's so little that makes any sense out of this movie, and it's baffling. So you wanted to talk about the director, is that right?
Yeah. I don't really know how to pronounce his name. I probably should, but I don't. But it'd be like
Urueta or something like that.
Yeah.
Chano Urueta. I'm not gonna.
Urueta. Yeah. I don't know. He did a lot of stuff. So I just wanted to talk about it. A lot of stuff from that time. He stopped doing stuff in 74, but he has a lot of Mexican cinema credits, director credits specifically. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, he made some of the Blue Demon movies, which some people might not know who that is. Blue Demon was like a Mexican wrestler, but also a movie star Mexican wrestler, which exists in Mexico. And
no, they're huge over there.
And he's one of the first and biggest ones. I was looking up the credits, and this is a movie I haven't seen, which I want to now. It's called Blue Demon versus the Satanic Power, which is
that another wrestler or literally satanic power?
I don't know. I haven't seen it.
I'm intrigued,
but I want to. And that's really all I wanted to say. Is that I just mentioned the director and that they've done stuff and talk about Blue Demon.
Blue Demon.
Blue Demon.
That's amazing. Yeah. Okay, well, so what did you feel about the movie as a whole? I mean, I know you liked it, but
well, it's just a B movie. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. In this case, it's just really like easy to watch, just short, to the point. There's enough dumb stuff to keep you entertained. There's enough good stuff to keep you entertained. Yeah. It just kind of has the mix. Like, I've watched so many B movies just being bored, waiting for something not great to happen.
Yeah.
But instead, the majority of the movie is just not entertaining or not interesting. And for a small segment of interesting, bad, poorly done stuff.
Yeah.
This isn't that.
No. I think taken all together, despite the movie's many, many flaws, the movie is really interesting. It's definitely, it's sort of made a place in cinema history for me personally. And it's a fun watch if you don't mind subtitles. Again, it's only an hour or so. So if, if you think you can tolerate an hour's worth of subtitles in the pursuit of watching like a really phenomenally strange movie, go for it. Without a budget and in a country not generally known at that point for their film industry, they've achieved something that Hollywood still struggles with. A sincerely intriguing movie, even if it is more about what the movie lacks than what it really has. And in that way, it sort of reminds me of Wicker Man. One day I will get into a longer discussion about the Wicker Man. I am referring to the original one with Christopher Lee and not the one about, Nick Cage's burnt toast. That movie is awful. The Nick Cage one is one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life. I was so disappointed. But the Wicker Man, for essentially what boiled down to company political reasons, was sort of cut up and shredded to bits. And it's really interesting. If you watch the movie in the original release that it had, it's really baffling. There are so many important things that have been cut from this movie. But if you watch the, I think it's called the expanded edition, you really do get a full movie, and it's a very good movie. So it's, and that's not even the full movie. There are scenes that are apparently lost forever or seem to be lost forever. But anyway, I'm getting way off topic, and I said I wasn't going to talk about the Wicker Man. So, but yes, if you're interested in all of these weird film mishaps and stuff like that, and really picking apart a movie, not to be a dick about it, but just to see what sort of things can go wrong for a film, I think the Braniac is a really good one to watch, as well as the Wicker Man, honestly, especially if you watch both versions. And then there's a really good commentary track on the Wicker Man expanded version or extended version, whatever that one is.
Yeah.
Christopher Lee does it.
Doesn't the director is on there?
The director might be on there.
I think it might be the director and Christopher Lee.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah, it's very good, insightful.
Yeah.
Christopher Lee loved
that
movie. I believe he helped finance it.
I think he did. And I think he said it was one of his favorite movies that he'd ever done.
And he's done a lot of movies.
Yeah, he has. He's done a lot of stuff. And this is I think for him, this is sort of the one that got away in a lot of respects. He really wanted the movie restored.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'll go into an actual discussion of The Wicker Man another time. It's a really great film. Just don't watch the standard version that you see out there. And whatever you do, don't watch the Nicolas Cage version. No, the Nicolas Cage
one's hilarious.
It's so bad. It's so bad. And I like Nicolas Cage. I am a fan. I consider myself a fan. That was not all his fault. A lot of it was the rewriting of that movie. But anyway, we gotta go. Thank you so much for watching this, listening to this, whatever. If you, have any comments or, anything like that about, the show or any of the movies, or if you know anything about the Braniac, or if you know where the missing reels are for Wicker Man, that's cool too. I'll take that. And just please send me an email at reclusehorror@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, although I don't do anything on Instagram, YouTube. Of course, you can find this podcast or recommend it to people through Podcast Addict, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and as of tomorrow, I believe, also on Google Play. So if you know somebody who doesn't really have a podcasting app per se, you can send them towards the Google Play thing if they have an Android phone. So yeah, did you have any final comments on anything?
Just my rating on Braniac.
What's your rating on Braniac?
Give it 10 out of 10 sparklers.
10 out of 10 sparklers.
It's that good.
Terrific. That good. It is. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for listening and have a great evening.